assume major changes happen instantly. They don't. Empires don't vanish in a day. Cultures don't transform in a year. Families don't disintegrate after a single argument. The deepest changes happen slowly enough that most people never notice them occurring until they wake up one day and realize the world around them feels completely different. Ripperger believes that's exactly where we are now, not at the beginning of a transformation, but somewhere in the middle of one. And what concerns him most is that many people still think normal conditions will eventually return, that things will simply reset, that the confusion is temporary. But what if it isn't? What if the confusion itself is the sign? What if the instability isn't an interruption? What if it's evidence of a deeper shift already underway? Those questions become even more unsettling when he turns his attention to what he calls the primary target, the family. Because if you study history carefully, something remarkable emerges. Every enduring civilization depended upon stable families, different cultures, different languages, different governments, different religions. But the family remained central. It was where values were transmitted, entity was formed, beliefs were taught, character was shaped, Rome that foundation, and everything built on top becomes vulnerable. Ripperger argues that this isn't accidental. He believes attacks on family stability aren't isolated social developments. He believes they're strategic. And whether one agrees with that conclusion or not, his reasoning follows a fascinating pattern. First, redefine commitment, then weaken permanence, then separate responsibility from intimacy, then erode parental authority, then create confusion around identity itself. Each step makes the next one easier. Each change creates conditions for another change, until eventually, the institution that once transmitted culture across generations struggles to perform its most basic functions. And that's where he believes the consequences become visible. Because children don't grow up in a vacuum. Every generation inherits something from the generation before it. Strength or weakness, faith or confusion, clarity or uncertainty. The inheritance continues regardless. The only question is what gets passed down. According to Ripperger, one of the most significant developments of the modern era has been the growing absence of stable spiritual formation, not merely religious instruction. Formation, the process by which a person learns who they are, what they believe, and why any of it matters. Without that framework, people still search for answers. But now they're searching without a map. And when people search without a map, they often follow the loudest voice available, the most persuasive voice, the most emotionally satisfying voice, whether it's true or not. That's where his concerns about younger generations become especially intense. Because he argues that many young people aren't rejecting meaning. They're desperately looking for it. But they're looking in a landscape filled with substitutes, counterfeits, imitations, promises that appear profound, but ultimately leave them more lost than before. And here's where the story takes a surprising turn, because despite all his warnings, Ripperger doesn't describe young people as the problem. He describes them as evidence of a hunger that modern society failed to satisfy. A hunger for purpose, for transcendence, for truth, for something bigger than themselves. And when legitimate answers seem unavailable, people become vulnerable to illegitimate ones. That pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. But according to Ripperger, what makes the current moment unique is the scale. Never before have so many people been connected. Never before have ideas traveled so quickly. Never before have confusion and certainty spread through the same channels simultaneously. Which means every crisis accelerates, every trend multiplies, every influence expands faster than previous generations could have imagined. And that's why he believes the stakes are higher than most people realize. Because spiritual formation that once took years can now be dismantled in months. Beliefs that once survived generations can disappear in a single decade. And institutions that took centuries to build can lose credibility almost overnight. Yet, amid all this, he says most people remain focused on symptoms. They argue about politics. They argue about economics. They argue about culture. But they rarely ask what might be happening underneath all of it. What force drives the patterns itself? What explains the consistency? What explains why the same institutions appear under pressure at the same time? For Ripperger, the answer is clear. And it's an answer that makes many people uncomfortable because it requires taking the spiritual realm seriously, not symbolically, not metaphorically, seriously. The problem is that modern culture has trained people to view spiritual realities as optional, interesting, perhaps sexologically useful, maybe, but ultimately secondary. Ripperger rejects that assumption completely. In fact, he flips it upside down. He argues that spiritual reality isn't secondary at all. It's primary. Everything else flows from it, which means the battle people think they're fighting may not actually be the battle they're in. And if that's true, then a much larger question emerges. What exactly are people using to defend themselves? Because if a threat is material, material solutions make sense. If a threat is financial, financial solutions make sense. If a threat is political, political solutions make sense. But if the threat is spiritual, then none of those tools are sufficient. What if the greatest threat facing your family isn't something you can see? Not a war on the horizon, not a financial collapse, not a political movement, but something far older, far more patient, and according to one of the most controversial voices in modern Catholicism, already operating in plain sight. Because while most people are worried about the next election, the next economics crisis, or the next headline flashing across their screens, Father Chad Ripperger says they're looking in the wrong direction. And if he's right, then the real battle isn't approaching. It has already begun. That statement alone sounds dramatic, maybe even extreme. But here's what makes it difficult to ignore. Chad Ripperger isn't known for making casual claims. For decades, he has served as a priest, theologian, and exorcist. His work has placed him in situations that most people will never encounter, and many wouldn't even believe. And after years spent confronting what he describes as the darkest manifestations of spiritual evil, he says something has changed. Not eventually, not someday, now. And the reason he believes that matters is because the signs aren't appearing in isolated corners of society. They're appearing everywhere. In homes, in schools, in families, in churches. And perhaps most unsettling of all, in the minds of ordinary people who have no idea they're standing in the middle of what he sees as a spiritual battlefield. But before you dismiss this as fear-mongering, consider something. Every civilization in history believed it was immune to collapse right up until the moment it wasn't. Every generation assumed the foundations beneath them were permanent until those foundations began to crack. And according to Ripperger, the cracks we're seeing today aren't random. They aren't disconnected events. They're pieces of a much larger pattern. A pattern that leads to a question few people are willing to ask. What happens when an entire culture slowly disconnects itself from the very thing that once held it together? That's where his warning begins. Because in his view, the story isn't primarily political. It's not economic. It's not technological. It's spiritual. And whether you agree with him or not, the implications are impossible to ignore. For years, many people assumed that religion would gradually become less important. Science would advance. Technology would solve problems. Society would become more educated, more enlightened, more rational. The supernatural would quietly fade into the background. But something strange happened. The more modern society became, the more people seemed to search for meaning elsewhere. Anxiety surged. Depression climbed. Loneliness reached levels that would have seemed unimaginable only a generation ago. And while psychologists, sociologists, and economists have proposed countless explanations, Ripperger believes they're often describing symptoms rather than causes, because from his perspective, the deeper problem lies beneath the surface. He argues that human beings were never designed to exist without a connection to the transcendent. Roam that connection, and a vacuum forms. And history teaches a fascinating lesson about vacuums. They never stay empty for long. That's where his concerns become significantly more serious. Because he believes modern society has spent decades tearing down traditional spiritual structures without understanding what would replace them. Faith declined. Religious practice declined. Sacramental participation declined. But the desire for transcendence never disappeared. It simply changed direction. And what filled the void was something entirely different. Notice what's happened over the last few decades. Millions of people who reject traditional religion still pursue spiritual experiences. They explore mysticism, energy healing, monestation, astrology, occult symbolism, ancient rituals, alternative spiritual systems. The language changes, but the search remains. Human beings continue reaching toward something beyond themselves. The question is whether they understand what they're reaching for. According to Ripperger, that's where the danger begins. Because he believes many people are opening doors they don't even realize exist. And whether one accepts that conclusion or not, his reasoning follows a chain that deserves attention. First, society teaches that the spiritual realm isn't real. Then people stop learning how to navigate it. Then they begin experimenting with ideas, practices, and experiences they don't fully understand. And finally, they become vulnerable precisely because they never believed vulnerability was possible. It's a paradox. The less seriously people take spiritual danger, the more exposed they become to it, at least in his view. But that's only the beginning, because Ripperger argues that the real shift isn't happening at the level of individuals. It's happening at the level of civilization. And to understand why that matters, he points to a question that most people never ask. Why do certain periods of history seem to unravel all at once? Why do moral norms collapse together? Why do institutions lose credibility simultaneously? Why do families weaken at the same moment trust disappears, communities fragment, and social cohesion begins to break apart? Many observers treat these developments as unrelated. Ripperger doesn't. He sees them as connected, cause and effect, one leading to another, like dominoes falling across generations. And that leads to a warning that has become central to his message. A civilization doesn't collapse overnight. It weakens gradually, quietly, almost invisibly, until suddenly everyone notices. But by then, the process has already been underway for decades. Think about how often people themselves. That's where Ripperger believes many people are dangerously unprepared. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack resources, but because they're preparing for one kind of conflict while living through another. And according to him, that mismatch creates vulnerability. A vulnerability most people don't even recognize. Which brings us to perhaps the most controversial part of his warning, because after describing cultural decline, family instability, and spiritual confusion, he asks a question that changes the entire conversation. What if these developments aren't isolated? What if they're connected by a deeper logic, a deeper strategy, a deeper purpose? That idea immediately raises another question. If there is a strategy, then who benefits from it? And if there is a purpose, where does it lead? Ripperger's answer is stark. But before he arrives there, he points to something else. History's greatest battles were often invisible before they became obvious. People living through them rarely understood their significance in real time. Only later did the pattern become clear. Only later did people recognize the warning signs they had ignored. And that's exactly what he fears may be happening now. Because from his perspective, modern society isn't merely experiencing turbulence, it's experiencing a test. A test of what remains when comfort disappears. A test of what survives when institutions weaken. A test of whether faith was real or merely convenient. And according to him, that test is already underway. Now, the troubling part is that most people still believe preparation can wait, that serious decisions can be postponed, that spiritual questions can be addressed later. After the next promotion, after the next vacation, after the next crisis passes. But what if later never arrives? What if the preparation required tomorrow has to begin today? That's the question at the center of everything he's saying. And it's also where the story becomes far more personal. Because up to this point, it's easy to think about civilization, culture, institutions, generations, large, abstract ideas, but the real issue isn't society, it's you, it's your family, your habits, your beliefs, the things you trust, the things you ignore, the choices that seem small now, but become enormous over time. And according to Ripperger, that's exactly where the next stage of the battle unfolds, not in governments, not in headlines, but in ordinary lives that often have no idea what's coming next. And what he claims to have witnessed behind closed doors may be the reason he's so convinced that the warning can no longer be ignored. Because once he begins describing what he has seen as an exorcist and why he believes those experiences reveal something much larger, the conversation takes a turn that few people are prepared for. And that's where the story gets even more unsettling. What makes Chad Ripperger's warning so unsettling isn't merely what he says is happening. It's why he believes it's happening. Because after decades of working in one of the most controversial areas of the Catholic Church. He claims the patterns he's witnessed point towards something far larger than isolated cases. In his view, the stories that reach an exorcist's office are not random anomalies scattered across society. They are signals, indicators, symptoms of a deeper spiritual condition that many people fail to recognize until the consequences become impossible to ignore. And that observation leads him to a distinction that most people never make. When people hear the word demonic, their minds immediately jump to dramatic scenes from movies. Possession, screaming, supernatural manifestations. But Ripperger argues that this book misses the point entirely because the most effective influence is often the least visible. A force that announces itself loudly is easy to resist. A force that disguises itself as ordinary thought, ordinary temptation, or ordinary compromise can operate unnoticed for years. And if that's true, then the greatest danger isn't dramatic evil. It's subtle evil that gradually becomes normal. That idea changes everything because it shifts the battlefield from rare, extraordinary events to everyday life. Suddenly, the struggle isn't happening somewhere else. It's happening in habits, choices, in priorities, in the countless small decisions that shape a person's character over time. And according to Ripperger, that's precisely why so many people underestimate the stakes. They assume life is neutral. They assume every choice exists in isolation. But he argues that choices build trajectories, and trajectories eventually become destinies. The reason this matters is because history repeatedly demonstrates a strange truth. Major collapses rarely begin with dramatic catastrophes. They begin with small compromises that seem harmless in the moment. Standards weaken slightly. Expectations lower slightly. Principles bend slightly. Nothing appears catastrophic. Yet over time, the accumulation becomes impossible to reverse. And before anyone realizes what's happened, a culture that once seemed stable finds itself struggling to remember what it believed in the first place. Ripperger believes modern civilization is facing exactly that problem. Not because people have become uniquely evil, but because they've become increasingly disconnected from the sources that once grounded them. The result is a population surrounded by information, yet starving for wisdom. Connected digitally, yet isolated personally. Entertained constantly, yet searching desperately for meaning. And perhaps nowhere is that contradiction more visible than in the rising sense of anxiety that seems to define the modern age. Because despite unprecedented levels of technology, comfort, and convenience, countless people still feel something is missing. They sense a void they cannot explain. They achieve goals they thought would satisfy them, only to discover the satisfaction fades almost immediately. They chase success, experiences, and distractions, yet the restlessness remains. According to Ripperger, that restlessness isn't accidental. It's evidence that human beings were created for something more than consumption, comfort, and entertainment. But here's where his message takes an unexpected turn. Because after describing cultural decline, spiritual confusion, and growing instability, he refuses to end with despair. In fact, he argues that despair itself is one of the greatest traps a person can fall into. Why? Because despair convinces people that action is pointless. It persuades them that the battle is already lost. And once a person believes that, they stop fighting entirely. Instead, Ripperger points to something history often forgets. Every period of crisis has also produced extraordinary renewal. Every era of confusion has generated individuals who chose clarity. Every age of darkness has produced people willing to become sources of light. The pattern repeats again and again because collapse is never the entire story. Alongside decline, there is always resistance. Alongside corruption, there is always fidelity. Alongside confusion, there is always truth waiting to be rediscovered. That's why he believes preparation matters more than prediction. Notice that he spends remarkably little time trying to forecast exact events. He doesn't claim to know precise timelines. He doesn't claim to possess secret revelations. What concerns him is readiness, because regardless of what the future holds, the same question remains. If difficulty arrives tomorrow, who will be prepared to endure it? If pressure increases, whose foundations will hold? If the culture becomes increasingly hostile to faith, conviction, and truth, who will remain standing? Those questions lead directly to what he sees as the solution. Not panic, not obsession, not fear, preparation. And in his framework, preparation begins long before any crisis becomes visible. It begins with forming habits when life is comfortable. It begins with strengthening character before hardship arrives. It begins with building conviction before that conviction is tested. Because once a storm begins, it's too late to build the shelter. This principle appears everywhere in life. Athletes train before competition. Soldiers prepare before battle. Students study before examinations. Yet spiritually, many people assume preparation can wait until after difficulties emerge. Ripperger argues that this assumption is one of the most dangerous mistakes a person can make. Because crises don't create character. They reveal it. They expose whatever was already present beneath the surface. And that brings us to what may be the most powerful part of his entire message. Beneath every warning, every caution, and every prediction lies a challenge. A challenge directed not toward institutions or governments, but toward individuals. Because civilizations are ultimately built from people. Families are built from people. Communities are built from people. If renewal is ever going to happen, it begins with personal transformation before it's outward. That realization changes the story completely. Suddenly, the question isn't whether society is declining. The question is what you're becoming. It's not whether culture is confused. It's whether you possess clarity. It's whether darkness exists. It's not whether darkness exists. It's whether you're contributing light. Because regardless of what happens around you, those decisions remain within your control. And perhaps that's why Ripperger's message continues to resonate with so many people. Not because it offers comfort, but because it offers responsibility. It refuses to treat individuals as helpless victims of history. Instead, it insists that every person still possesses the freedom to choose a different path, to become stronger, to become wiser, to become more faithful, to become the kind of person capable of enduring whatever comes next. By the end of his warning, the central issue is no longer demons, culture wars, or societal collapse. The central issue is choice. The same choice every generation eventually faces. Will comfort be your highest priority or truth? Will convenience guide your decisions or conviction? Will you drift wherever circumstances carry you? Or will you deliberately choose the direction of your life? Because according to Chad Ripperger, history is approaching another turning point. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not next year. but soon enough that preparation can no longer be postponed. And whether his warnings prove completely accurate or not, one reality remains impossible to deny. Every civilization faces moments that reveal what it truly believes. Every family faces moments that reveal what it truly values. Every individual faces moments that reveal who they really are. The question is not whether that moment will come. The question is whether you'll be ready when it does. And if there is one final lesson hidden beneath everything, Ripperger says, it may be this. Fear is not the point. Awareness is. Panic is not the goal. Preparation is. The future remains uncertain, but your response to it does not have to be. Because while no one can control the events that lie ahead, every person can decide today what kind of foundation they are building. And when the winds begin to rise, when the pressure intensifies, and when uncertainty spreads, that foundation may prove to be the difference between collapse and endurance. Which means the real warning was never about what has already begun. The real warning is about what happens if people keep pretending nothing is happening at all. And the choice, as Ripperger would say, still remains yours.